Welcome to Relationscapes, the podcast where we explore gender, sexuality, race, and more in order to make the world better for everybody. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and our guide in this episode is neuroscientist Daphna Joel.
No two brains are the same, so each person has a unique mosaic of male typical and female typical characteristics. So in the brain, we can say that we are all intersex, or I use the word mosaic.
All of us grow up swimming in gender stereotypes. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Women are emotional, and men are rational. Women's brains are like spaghetti, and men's are like waffles. And that's actually a real one that there are people out there teaching, so you can Google it. But secretly, and not so secretly, a lot of people feel like these binary cliches actually don't fit. Daphna Joel is a neuroscientist who wanted to know what the science actually says about this stuff. And when she looked at real human brains, she found something far more interesting. Each of us carries a unique mix of traits, a true mosaic that defies the old binary. Daphna Joel joins us to talk about her groundbreaking book, Gender Mosaic, Beyond the Myth of the Male and Female Brain. Daphna Joel, welcome to Relationscapes.
Great to be here.
I wondered if you grew up believing that there were male brains and female brains and that they were very different. Was that something that you grew up with?
I wouldn't say I grew up with, but I was aware of this myth. Reading the male brain and the female brain, or men from Mars, women from Venus, and other books like this.
Okay, so you had that idea, but did you always think, that doesn't seem right to me?
I never felt it really applied to me. I didn't feel like I belonged to one of these very, stereotypical characters.
So from your own experience, you were like, okay, you have these two categories, but I'm not really feeling that myself.
Right.
Okay, cool. Your book starts off by showing us how scientific questions are never really far away from social and political concerns. There's an idea that science is unbiased and objective and that it's not involved with politics, for example. And your history shows that's a little bit different. So back in the 17th and 18th centuries, there were Enlightenment thinkers that started arguing that all humans were equal by nature, regardless of sex. And that was a problem for a lot of people because women were seen as the weaker sex at that time. They were expected to play certain roles in society. So they wanted to resolve that debate. And you say that you've been impressed with the creativity that went into using science to serve that social agenda. Talk about that creativity a little bit.
Yeah, and so you describe it very well. And I would just add to this that before we had science, we had a religion explaining reality to us, both the physical reality, but also, of course, the social reality. And science tried to explain not just the physical reality, and this is usually how we think of science, as explaining physical reality, but also social reality. And they also tried to keep social order, even though it, as you said, it wasn't aligning with ideas of equality, etc. And they have been using science not just to justify inequality between men and women, but also, between other groups like blacks and whites, and the poor and the rich, etc. And at least in the case of sex, it seems like a very easy task because they knew already that the brain has something to do with intelligence, and that they couldn't measure the brain directly, but they could measure the skull. And, it's very easy to see that men have on average bigger skulls than women. So this seemed like a very easy explanation of men have bigger brains, they are smarter, and this is why we have this social order. And the difficulty was because they looked around at nature, and there are some examples of animals with much larger brains and skulls than humans, like whales and elephants, etc. And obviously, the people that wanted to explain how men are superior to women didn't want to claim that elephants are superior to humans. So they had to find a solution. And they did. They said, okay, what's important is not the absolute size of the skull, but the relative size of the skull compared to the body. And when you look at this ratio, then humans did have a higher ratio than whales or elephants. Okay, they were relieved. But then they noticed that actually women have larger skulls in comparison to the, size of the
Uh-oh.
body. Okay, now,
Well, that
now
solution didn't work.
right. And now, if we really believed in, or if science was really what we are thinking of it, then you would say that they would say, okay, so women have larger ratio of skull to body size. Then obviously women are the smarter sex, and we should simply just change social structure to reflect this, and we'll have a better society. Well, this didn't happen. And they had to find a solution, and they did. So, and what you see when you follow, and I didn't do the historical research, but there are several, very interesting scientists that did, like Londa Schibinger from Stanford. And when you look at the history, what you see is that each time that the, explanation of the inequality ran into problems, they simply change the explanation. And you see how this goes. So it's very obvious that they have a target or an aim, and this is to explain why men are better than women. And then it's just the details that are changing. And this is even true today. So what is changing is the content of the myth. And it changes because, neuroscience is progressing, and we can measure the brain, we can measure very sophisticated things within the brain. So the details are always changing, but the end or the conclusion is always the same. And this is explaining why the brain or differences in the brain has to be manifested in a way that explains current social injustice or inequality.
Right. So they started off with the skulls. That led to a dead end. They also moved to, you talk about Broca, who is a famous scientist. Broca's area, people might have heard of that as part of our brains. They started looking at the actual brains, right? So looking at the shape of brains. And then they started looking at ventricles to say, oh, well, these ventricles in the brain seem to be different in male and female bodies. And in the book, you write that what's worrying, I mean, we can sort of like chuckle about this history because it's so obvious. When we look at the past, it's obvious to kind of laugh about that. But as you said, it's still kind of happening today. And what you say is it's worrying that sex differences are still being used to justify gender equality today. And that's a little bit different than racism or class. There are still some people that point to physiological differences to justify racism and classism, but it seems to be a lot less common to do that than it is for sex and gender.
Yeah, I think and again, it's important to look at history and realize that actually sex is the only thing that didn't change or that is still legitimate to talk about, differences in the brain as explaining inequality in social life between men and women. And we wouldn't do it for any other social class, even though there are differences in the brain. So if you compare the brain from people born in China and people born in the West, there are differences between their brains. But no one would claim that Chinese people are, better in math because of something in the brain, or are worse in something else because of something in the brain, or the other way around.
Let's talk about some of those real differences because, as you said, there are some differences in male and female brains that scientists today might point to, hundreds of differences. Give us some examples of what the differences are.
So the first and main difference is the difference in brain size. So this was true also already in the 17th century. This was true. So on average, men have larger brains than women, and it corresponds quite well with the body size, although it's not a direct linear relation. So everything in the body of men is on average larger than in the body of women, and the brain is one of them. So first question is how you take this into account, because it's not really interesting because everything within the brain is also on average larger in the brains of men. So one thing that you do is you take this into account, and then you ask, are there differences that go beyond this difference in brain size? Or in other words, if I take a brain of a group of men and a group of women, that the average brain size is similar, so it will be smaller men and larger women in terms of body size, would we still see differences there? And if we do, then we can say these are sex differences. So it has nothing to do with the overall brain size. So when you do this, you find very little differences, and they are much smaller. But you do find still differences. So it can be a difference in the size of a specific region in the brain, which could be on average smaller or larger in men or women. It could be density of specific type of neurons in a specific region. It could be some differences in the microstructure of the brain. So, how the dendritic tree is organized and things like this. So, many things that we can measure in the brain, in many we can find differences, but the differences are mostly small with a lot of overlap.
Yeah, I think that overlap is what really stands out to me, because if people really were to believe that brain size is determinant of intelligence, for example, if you got a bigger brain, you're smarter. Well, there are some women's whose brains would be larger than some men's brains, right? So we would have to say, okay, well, if it's just about brain size, that means we do have some women who are a lot smarter than men because of their brain size. And so breaking it down by sex doesn't work on that level, even if we accepted the presumption that brain size was the key factor.
I don't know you could do this again to take similarly sized brains and then see if this works. And a good example for
Yeah.
this is Albert Einstein, for example, who is considered quite smart. He used to be very smart, and he had a very small brain. And again, this is not surprising because he was a small man, so he had a small
Yeah.
brain. But so obviously, how smart you are and how intelligent you are has very little to do with how big your brain is. And this is, you talked before about the ventricles. So larger brains also come with larger ventricles. So these are the empty spaces in the brain that are filled with fluid. So does it mean that men are not as smart because they have these big holes in the brain? No, this is all, has nothing to do with reality and how the brain works. And as I said in the book, women do just fine with their smaller brains. Men do just fine with their larger ventricles. We are okay.
Right. And then, as you said, there's also some overlap. There might be a woman who has larger ventricles than a particular man did, so what are some other examples of the way that popular media kind of talks about differences in male and female brains? In the book, you discuss a few examples that you see it in the media and you're like, oh no, here we go again with with the Mars and Venus situation.
Okay, so there are several biases or common misconceptions. The first is that usually we think of differences in the brain as innate. So when we find a difference in biology or in the brain, we think that this is an innate difference. And of course, a difference in the brain gives us no information about the source of the difference, or in other words, about the nature-nurture debate, why we have this difference. So this is the first very common misconception. The other thing is that we think of differences between males and females in the brain and in anything else in binary terms. So even when there is large overlap between males and females, we think of the differences as binary, as like men are this way, women are that way. Never true in the brain, in human brains. And the third misconception is that within the binary framework, we think that differences add up consistently within individuals to create two types. And this is the logic of the genitalia. So if you think of male genitalia and female genitalia, indeed this is the case. So male genitalia is characterized by having only male typical genital organs, and similarly for female genitalia. And we use this logic when we think of brains. And this is why often scientists, when they find differences between men and women, they assume that what's typical of the male brain is to have male typical brain characteristics, and what's typical of the female brain is to have female typical brain characteristics. And what we've shown in many different studies of many different things that you can measure in the human brain is that this is not the case. So in the brain, and this is in contrast to the genitalia, what's typical of human brains is to have both male typical and female typical characteristics. So if we were using the terminology of that we use for genitalia, we have male genitalia, female genitalia, and then some people have intersex genitalia. So in the brain, we can say that we are all intersex. Or I use the word mosaic. So each person has a unique mosaic, no two brains are the same, of male typical and female typical characteristics.
The book's so helpful this way in teaching media literacy, because you want to remind people when they see a headline that says something like, men are better at multitasking than women, or whatever, that those studies, we should take a look at what those studies are, because a lot of times those are the result of maybe like one experiment that somebody ran at a university someplace, and the results aren't being replicated, that it's presenting one study as representative of everything. And so being aware of what's behind the claims in the media is really important, especially when it comes to these headlines, because they'll grab your attention, right? Men sleep better than women, or this or that. Like, it's always this binary presented as scientific fact, but when you start looking at the studies behind them, you say that it's usually small, limited studies. These things aren't being replicated, and it's just kind of some headline grabbing stories.
Right, this is true. But I want to stress that this idea that each brain is a unique mosaic of characteristics, this is not a result of this problem that you were rightly mentioning,
Hmm.
but this is actually how sex affects the brain. And this idea of the mosaic, I came up with it from reading a lot of animal studies, which looked at sex differences in the brain. And what I saw in these studies is that sex differences, for example, in the brains of rats, can be opposite under different conditions. So what's typical of males can be typical of females, and what's typical of females can be typical of males under a different set of conditions. And these interactions between sex and many other factors is different for different brain features. And this is why sex differences in the brain mix up instead of adding up consistently. And we recently showed this in the rat brain. So also in the brains of rats, you can see these mosaics. So most rats will have a mosaic of male typical and female typical characteristics. So this is really important. And again, when you go back to what you mentioned, this is one of the reasons why different studies are not consistent. Because differences that you see, for example, in the brain between men and women can be different under different conditions. For example, because of the lot of amount of stress, probably many sex differences would be different now because of the long exposure to stress, which affects the brain and interaction with sex-related factors.
Right. Let's talk about brain plasticity a little more. We're touching on it already. Define brain plasticity for us.
So this is the most interesting, I think, characteristics of brains is that they can change in response to experience, in response to the environment. And this is what makes us such, creatures that are specifically built for learning. This allows us to learn from experience because our brain keeps changing as we go in the environment, as we experience things, as we behave. So brain plasticity can be changes in the short time scale, changes in synapses strengths, changes in the organization of dendrites, and it can be long-term changes in which neurons are participating in which action, etc. So you can see the differences also with MRI in humans following training in very simple tasks that, for example, involve the fingers. Then you can see changes in blood flow in the brain, in the fingers areas. So we can see this, and of course in animals we can look at more sophisticated things or more microscopic things and see these kind of changes. So many features of the brain can change in response to environmental and experiential events.
This is where the nature versus nurture puzzle can really be looked at, because let's say there's a study that you talk about in the book about London taxi drivers, that they did these studies on London taxi drivers and found that they had huge hippocampus areas of their brains. So if we didn't think about nature versus nurture, we just happened to pick a bunch of taxi drivers for our study and looked at them, and we took a bunch of taxi drivers who were men and then compared them to a bunch of women, we might conclude, wow, men have huge hippocampuses compared to women, and assume that it's based on sex, when in reality you say, no, if you look at what the London taxi drivers have experienced in their lives, the nurture side of things, this explains where the difference in hippocampus comes from.
Right. And this is really an interesting experiment that they did, because in the beginning, what they found is a difference between London taxi drivers and and people that are not London taxi drivers. And just finding the difference is not enough to know the source, because it could be that only people with, very large hippocampus can be a taxi driver because they need to memorize all the streets.
Yeah, like that's why they became taxi drivers. They were born with it.
Right.
Yeah.
And usually this is how, when you look at sex differences, this is usually how you use it. You say, okay, we see this difference, and this is why men are better at math, or they are, more in STEM studies, and women are something else, more empathic. But what they could do also, I think in a second study, and I hope I remember correctly, they compared younger and older drivers, so people with more
Right.
experience and less experience. And then, although it's not a proper experiment, but it's much better, and they could see that indeed it correlates with the time that you were driving. And this strongly suggests that it is the driving and the experience that is driving this difference or the size of the hippocampus.
Right. And this is where nature and nurture comes up when it comes to gender, because people can assume that boys are certain ways and girls are certain ways. And so, in the ways that they're raised, in the ways that society interacts with them, that can actually shape physical brain features that we can actually be impacting what we assume are sexed brains, when in reality, culture is helping to make that happen.
Right. So we can talk about gendered brains instead of sex brains. So the nature-nurture debate, we can talk about why we are so obsessed with this, but let's leave this aside for a minute. It's important to think of this or to understand that this is another binary that doesn't really exist. Because at least for the brain, development is part of the nature of the brain. So there is no point of thinking about brains outside of nurture. So brains are developing. We are not born with a full functioning brain, or it has to go through so much developmental stages until it reaches after the age of 20. So we are talking about many years of development of the brain. And so obviously the interactions with the environment are part of how the brain is supposed to be built up. So brains without environment, they wouldn't be functioning well. And it's not the same for every organ in our body, okay? But specifically for the brain. So first, the nature-nurture is, problematic in this debate, as if these are two independent processes. Now, to know whether a difference that we see between men and women in the brain is a result of nature or nurture is almost impossible, because we cannot disentangle the two. The only thing is that if we found differences in the brains of neonatals, newly born babies, then we can say, okay, this is, innate. This is not the result of the environment. And I was looking for many years for a study, because I knew they were working on this. So they had a study of many hundreds of newborn babies. And I was looking for the results, because I wanted to analyze the mosaic and see whether babies are already born with a mosaic brain, because we knew from animal studies that manipulations that are carried out already in utero can do this reversal of sex differences. When finally the study came out, it turned out that they have very few sex differences in the brain. So the main difference between the brains of male and female babies is, again, the size of the brain. Once you take this into account, almost no differences. So we couldn't do the mosaic analysis. Most of the differences in the human brain, they appear only later in life, around puberty and later. Now, I want to stress this doesn't mean that there are not innate, or if you want, you can better say pre-programmed differences. If you take the difference in the form of the chest of the males and females, it changes only, or the difference appears only in puberty. Doesn't mean that it's not pre-programmed, this difference. Okay, doesn't mean that this is environmental. So the fact that differences appear later is not a proof that they are environmental, but then you cannot disprove that it's not environmental. So we don't have good evidence for innate or pre-programmed sex differences in the human brain, but we do have many types of evidence for environmental effects on the brain. So there is lots of evidence to suggest that many of the differences that we see between the brains of men and women are the results of gender, but this doesn't exclude the possibility that sex also contributes to some of these differences. And I want to stress, from animal studies, we do know that sex-related factors, especially sex-related hormones, like testosterone, progesterone, estradiol, they all affect many aspects of the brain. And this is probably also true for humans. The point of interest, or the point of the divergence between brains and genitalia, is that in the brain, how these hormones affect the brain depends on other factors, and in fact can be opposite under different environmental conditions. And this is a result why we don't have male and female brains, while we do have male and female genitalia. It's not because sex does not affect the brain, it's because how it affects the brain depends on so many other factors. And this is why these effects do not add up to two types of systems, male brains and female
Right.
brains.
This is where it gets so tricky because some people want you to just say, yes, there are male brains and there are female brains. They are different. And other folks might want you to just say, no, there's one type of brain and that's it. And your picture is more complicated than both of those things. You're not saying that there isn't a male and female brain. You're not saying that it's completely different or completely the same.
Right. So, and again, because this is the question that people are concerned with, is within the binary framework. And within the binary framework, there are only two options. Either we are the same or we are different, with different meaning belonging to two types.
Mm-hmm.
And what we show is that we are not the same and we are not different in terms of belonging to two types. In fact, each brain is very different from any other brain. And we managed to show this using many different machine learning algorithms, etc. What's important here is sex category. So knowing someone's sex category, for example, that I'm female, doesn't give you almost any information about the specific structure of the brain, and also about similarities and differences between someone's brain and someone else's brain. So the right answer to the question, are we the same or different, is that everyone is different, and sex category provides very little information on how two brains are similar or different.
Looking at brain scans, I wanted to ask you about that. So could we look at a brain scan and guess pretty well what the sex of the person is?
We can actually do this, and the accuracy would be quite good if we didn't correct for brain size. So basically, you would say if it's a large brain, probably it's a male brain from a male, and if it's a small brain, probably it's from a female. If you correct for brain size, the accuracy drops, so it would be around 60%, considering that 50% is chance is not very good, but it's better than chance. But the interesting question is the reverse prediction. So usually, if I want to know if you are male or female, there is no point in putting you in the scanner, paying, I don't know, several $100s, and then guessing with 60 or 70% chance whether you are male or female. I look at you, I have a very good, pretty good guess that you are male. So, and the question is the opposite. So I know that you are male, and if I'm not sure, I can, just ask you again. I don't need an MRI scan. And then the question is, what do I know about your brain? And the answer is very little. And again, and this is different from the genitalia, because knowing that you are male, even though I haven't seen your genitalia, I know a lot of information about your genitalia, and especially I can guess, have a good guess of what type of genital organs you have, and even more so, what type of genital organs you do not have. When it comes to the brain, I have no information. I don't know which features of the brain, of your brain, would be in the male typical form and which would be in the female typical form. No idea how similar your brain would be to mine. Nothing. So it's the complete opposite. And this is really important because, again, usually within the binary framework, when we hear that the sex-related factors affect the brain, that there are sex differences in the brain, etc., we immediately think that this means that there are two types of brains, that knowing someone's sex category provides a lot of information about their brain. This is true within a binary framework. But in the brain, because of the mosaic, this is not true. And again, I want to make this distinction. Sex-related factors affect the brain. I guess that your testosterone levels right now are higher than mine. This affects our brain. But how it affects our brain depends on many, many factors. And this is why in some domains we are very similar now in how our brain responds. In others, we are different. And okay, so this is an important thing to remember.
Okay, so it's like you could look at a brain scan and have a pretty good idea what the sex of the person was, but you could look at a person and not have a pretty good idea and be able to predict what that person's brain structure. You could look at me, I'm a bald guy, I have facial hair, my voice sounds low, but based on those things, you still would not be good at making a prediction about what my brain structure might be because of that.
Right. I wouldn't be able actually to predict it. It's not a good prediction. Just I really have no information. The only thing that I could say that probably you have more male typical features in your brain than female typical features. This is not very helpful because 51% male typical features and 49% female typical features would still fit in.
Right.
And also the question is, which features are in the male typical form? Right.
Right, and it would be ignoring all the female typical features that I have. It's sort of just dismissing all of those and assuming, okay, well, he's got a male brain, and we can just forget about all the female typical features that he has.
Right.
You use the idea of a blind date as a way to think about this. Talk about the blind date example, because this really helped me grasp what you were saying.
In a blind date, let's say, we are going on a blind date and we know that our partner is going to be, for the blind date, is going to be male. So again, this gives us a lot of information about his reproductive system, but doesn't give us any information about his brain. And specifically, and again, we can maybe talk a little bit about gender. This can help. So I can guess that if he is male, also he will have more masculine characteristics than feminine characteristics. But this is not very helpful because his masculine characteristics being aggressive and watching a lot of porn, or as his masculine characteristic is being great in sports and reading well maps. And I would also know that he will have some feminine characteristics. And again, it's really important which one. Would he be talking too much, or would he be empathic and warm? So it is the combination of characteristics of masculinity and femininity within this specific date that I'm having. This will determine whether I like this person or not, and whether we can, whether it can work between the two of us. And it depends not only on the specific combination of masculinity, of masculine and feminine characteristics, but also how it matches mine. Maybe both of us really like sports, or we will have a great time together. Although for him, this is a masculine characteristics, and also for me, but it's gender atypical because I am a woman. So the question is how two mosaics match. And we cannot know the mosaic of another person just by knowing this person's sex category.
Sex does play a role in brain structure, as you've mentioned, but it's not the only factor. And the kind of differences that you're looking at between brains can involve like the density of different brain regions, not just size, but like their density. How thick are they? How heavy are they? How much matter is there? Differences in neurotransmitters, differences in receptors. And then plus all of the external events that we encounter, how our parents were treating us, the stress that we're put under, the stress that our parents were put under, that our father could have been put under and that affected his sperm, or that a mother could have been put under that affected an embryo in the womb. So there's so many different factors. And also hormones, testosterone and estrogen can make a difference. Talk about that. And I'm kind of interested in how this connects to trans issues. People might have questions about what we know based on trans identities and brain structure.
So what we know is that sex-related hormones like testosterone, estradiol, progesterone affect our brain. And I want just to mention that we all have all these hormones. So often people treat these hormones as male hormones, female hormones, very misleading, because we all have all the types of hormones that are produced in the ovaries, in the testes, also in other tissues of the body. The level of these hormones fluctuates continuously within the bodies of females, within the body of males. Okay, so this, again, just to get rid of the binary when we talk about sex-related factors or sex-related hormones. And these hormones affect the brain. And we know, from animal studies, not so much from human studies, that they can affect many aspects of the brain, also of the developing brain in utero and also later in life. And it also affects our brain. So women who are ovulating and they experience the changes, these affect their brains. Of course, in pregnancy, following delivery, all these changes affect the brain, and women can experience this. But also, for example, postpartum, we have a very large change in hormones, and it affects and causes labile mood. So women are more emotional. But whether a woman would be or would experience postpartum depression or would be euphoric, okay, so you can see that the hormones do not determine the outcome. The outcome is a result of interaction between these drastic hormonal changes, but also probably her gene predispositions, the environment, whether the environment is supportive or not, and other things. So yes, sex-related hormones affect the brain, but how they affect the brain depends on many other factors. And this is why we are not all having the same effects, and it can be opposite for different people.
Right. So you can have a trans individual, like a trans woman who is really emotional and sort of stereotypically feminine, or a trans woman who's made more of like a tomboy, a tomboy trans woman, right? Like there are differences between all these different gender identities that when we see this across the board.
So I wouldn't say this the way you said it. So for trans, I would say two things. First, we do not know why some people are cisgender and why some people are transgender. And we looked at the brains of transgender individuals and found that also their brains are mosaic. So trans people are like all other people, they have a mosaic brain, at least in the things that we measured. Now, when trans people take hormones, and I want to remind us all that also cisgender people take hormones, specifically many women, cisgender women take hormones because like birth control pills, there are hormones. So when humans take hormones, regardless of the reason, this affects their brain. And some of these effects can be measured. But again, and there have been some studies on the brains of transgender individuals before and after they have been starting to take hormones. And you can see differences, but again, you see a lot of variability because if you take, for example, testosterone, how it will affect your brain depends on other factors. So it's not that all trans individuals would have the same response to testosterone in the brain.
Yeah, that's helpful. There's a quote that I'll read from the book that kind of sums all this up. You say that people who learn about my work sometimes mistakenly conclude I'm claiming there are no sex differences in the brain. I hope by now to have made it clear that that's not the case. Sex does affect the brain, and there are average differences between females and males in many brain features. But because of the interactions between sex and so many other factors, the effects of sex, that is, being female or male, are mixed up in a unique way in the brain of every individual.
Well said.
It is. It is well said. Again, it's something that I have to really work to wrap my mind around. Do you find yourself sort of repeating yourself? Like, what does it feel like to be a researcher on this topic when so many people have such strong feelings about it?
So actually, I was surprised. I was expecting, that people would throw tomatoes at me or something like this. But people really accept this very well. And I put some thought into this to try to understand why people really like this idea. And what I think is, and usually when I talk about the brain, I also talk about gender because it's easy because we don't know much about our brains, but everyone can, name a few masculine and a few feminine characteristics of their own. And our studies show that everyone is like this. So everyone has masculine and feminine characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is that it's actually easy for people to accept this is because it fits well the theory of gender. So everyone knows that there are gender differences. You look around in the world and there are gender differences. There are more, male basketball players and female basketball players. There are more men who are interested in, football than women. And we can name in each culture, it may be different. In Israel, no one watches football. Our football is your soccer. But anyway, so the differences may be different in different cultures, but everyone can name masculine and feminine characteristics. And the mosaic doesn't say that men and women are the same. It says, yes, you are right. There are differences. I don't know why the differences are there, but there are differences. The mosaic also say that every person has both feminine and masculine characteristics. Now, people know this about themselves. What they do not know is that everyone is like this. And I think that learning that everyone is like this is actually quite reassuring because we live in such a binary social system that some people do not feel comfortable in their gender atypical characteristics. And when they learn that everyone has gender atypical characteristics, maybe they are more at ease with the fact that they also have some gender atypical characteristics. So they don't have to add much to the gender theory of the world to accept the mosaic. But if you really understand the mosaics, deeply, what you realize is that the binary framework, this is where the problem is. This is what is wrong. So it's not about having differences between men and women in specific features. It's about thinking that men and women belong to two types. And this is not true. And this is why I think people, they don't have usually hard time accepting this.
That's Daphna Joel. She's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Tel Aviv University, one of today's revolutionary specialists on sex, brains, and gender. We're talking about their book, The Gender Mosaic: Beyond the Myth of the Male and Female Brain. Okay, let's unpack the mosaic metaphor a little bit more. So you've been talking about mosaic all along, and this is something that you've borrowed from the world of art. So describe what a mosaic is and how you came to bring it as a metaphor for your research.
So maybe, growing up in Israel, which have some very ancient history, and so mosaic is very common when you go in different ruins and stuff. Mosaic was a very common art, and I later learned that it's not as common in other parts of the world. So for me, the idea of a mosaic, of creating a picture from many different pieces, and each piece is in a different color, this was a very intuitive way of thinking about our findings with regard to brain and gender.
Yeah, so it's this art that just these colors in a different array. And in your book, you've got this amazing spread. These sort of, I believe that they're sort of brain scans that you've put side by side. And on one page there's women, and on the other page there's men, and you just see this, all the different colors there. That again, it's not on this side it's all the same color, and on that side it's all the same color. We just see this blend across both images that shows a lot of difference. There's a lot of difference between male brains. There seems to be as much difference between male brains as there is between male brains and female brains.
So I'm really glad you brought up these images, because we are talking and people do not see the images, but I really encourage people to go and look at these images, because one picture was thousands of words, and this is a very good example of this. Because what you can see in these images, we show in each line a single brain. So it's actually the volumes of 116 regions in each brain. And what you see at the group level, you can see the differences between men and women. And we use a color code of green to yellow between large and small. And what you see is that at the group level, there is more green at the women's side and more yellow at the men's side. But what you can also see, and exactly what you said, is that the brains are rarely all green or all yellow. Instead, each brain is a unique combination of green, which is more common in women, and yellow, which is more common in men. And I think this is important because, again, within the binary framework, it's really hard to understand how it could be that there are group level differences, but there are no two types. And when you look at these images, you get a new idea or a new model of how to think of sex in the brain, because you can see the group level differences, but you can also see that brains do not come in two types. Brains are not yellow and green.
You say that treating females and males as if they belong to two distinct, predictable types can result in a lot of annoying sexism, which is a problem. But you also suggest that it can be bad for our health. So talk about the effects of getting our ideas about brains wrong. How does that affect our health?
So it's not just about our brain, but the binary framework. The problem is that we see differences between men and women, and immediately we think of them within the binary framework as if men and women belong to two types. So, for example, people find differences in the cardiovascular system, and then they talk about men and women being so different as if they have two types of cardiovascular systems. And of course, this is wrong. And then you have a man coming into the emergency room with female typical symptoms, and then misdiagnosed because of this belief that, men do not have this. And another example is depression, for example, and even postpartum depression, which is considered a female problem. But many men, many new fathers experience postpartum depression, even though, of course, they weren't delivering by themselves. So a man suffering from postpartum depression would be misdiagnosed. No one will even consider the possibility. So this idea that some of the gender differences that we see in health outcomes or in health conditions are binary. So men have it, women don't, or the other way around, causes a lot of problems to the gender or sex category who typically do not show this as commonly as the other group. And then people are misdiagnosed. Another example is, for example, breast cancer in men. So this is obviously much rarer than in women, but men that do suffer from it are more likely to die of this, because usually they will be diagnosed much later, because no one considers the possibility that they could be suffering from breast cancer.
You also mentioned medicine and how dosages can be different and how bodies might need different doses. And when we're assuming this binary, it can cause problems with prescriptions.
Right. So for a long time, many studies have been done only on males. And this is a problem, assuming that females are just like males, and then therefore, if we study men, we can conclude that everyone is like this, and this is actually wrong. And then they switch to the other side of the continuum, and from the very important demand that both men and women are included in studies, they switch to assuming that men and women are so different, as if they belong to two types. And one example, for example, is
Hmm.
dosing. So there is with Ambien, a very common sleeping drug, and women suffered with higher rates from some side effects. But it wasn't that all women suffered from these side effects and all men didn't. It was just a quantitative difference. And they cut the dose for women in half. Now, this is a problem because later it was found that it's not a sex difference, but it relates mainly to the difference in body size. So, for example, big women would actually need the men's dose, if you want, and smaller men would need the female dose. And, and
Hmm.
this binary thinking and thinking or relating this to sex rather than to actually looking for the sex-related variable in this case, body size, and then giving you the dose you need according to your body size and not according to your sex category. So sex category, and this is important, sex category is rarely a cause of some sex difference. Usually it's other factors, some factors that are directly related to sex, for example, uh, sex related hormones, but it could be other things like body size, height, muscle to fat ratio, level of exercise, physical exercise. And a good example that I like to give is, let's think that you have heart problems and you come to your doctor. And we know from medicine that things that are important are whether you were smoking and how much physical activity and whether you are overweight, etc. So assume that instead of asking you, have you been smoking? How much have you been smoking? Are you doing physical exercise? Let's put you on the scale and see whether you're overweight or not. Instead of this, he would just look at you and say, okay, you are male, so obviously you have been smoking. You are doing a lot of physical exercise, and I'm not sure about your, body weight. Obviously, this is bad medicine.
Hmm.
So using sex category as a proxy for the actual factors that matter for your health condition. We should look for the actual factors and then measure them. Maybe we can affect them, because I can ask you to stop smoking or start to do more physical activity. I wouldn't ask you to, change your sex to treat your heart problems.
And we kind of do some of this ourselves. You talk about how doctors do this. We kind of do this. I'm thinking about your friend Lisa. She has three daughters, and you talk about how when they were growing up, she would say how girly they were. Oh, they're such girls. But they were all different from each other. The oldest was really affectionate and dreamy. The second one was sort of a born caregiver, and the third daughter loved to dress up and act. And you say the daughters also had some stereotypically boyish characteristics, but these were mostly overlooked. Instead, she was just, look how girly they are. So she was just identifying these particular things about them, and then that put them in the girl box. And then they kind of became a two-dimensional version of themselves. We kind of selectively look at people and assume things about them based on these stereotypes.
Right. So this goes to a very interesting question for me, at least, is if everyone is mosaic, why don't we see people as mosaics, and instead we see them as if they belong to two types? And we look around and we see
Hmm.
men and women, we don't see mosaics. And this is interesting. And what you just described, this is one of the reasons. So, for example, if I have a boy and he really love to play football, I would say, yeah, of course, he's a boy. He loves football. But then if he really likes to cook, I wouldn't say he's a boy, this is why he loves to cook. I would say, he likes to do things with me and I love to cook, so he likes to cook. And maybe I
Hmm.
also have a girl and she also is a great cook, really loves to cook. And I would say, yeah, obviously she loves to cook. She's a girl. And she also likes
Hmm.
to play football. And I'll say, yeah, of course, she goes after her brother or after her father. So we can see how we think of gender typical characteristics as if they are the result of our sex or gender. And we ignore gender atypicality, or we attribute this to other factors. And this is how we manage to keep the stereotypes. And one good example is if you have a very active girl, young girl, you would say she's a tomboy. So you actually see an active girl, but you reinforce the stereotypes that boys are active because you say that she is a tomboy. No, she's not a tomboy. She's an active girl, and girls can be active.
And this gets to your last chapter of the book, which is called Towards a World Without Gender. And that chapter title is going to just set off alarm bells for people who think that without gender, the social order will come crumbling down, that people will stop having babies, and that no one will know what's going on. And some of these ideas are rooted in religious beliefs, and some of them aren't. Some of them are just rooted in this is the way the world is. In fact, a lot of people think this is just science. There are men and women, and that's just science, don't you know? And so, what do you think about when you're saying towards a world without gender? What do you mean by that? How do you kind of respond when you get a strong response of, wow, that would just cause mass hysteria?
So first, I want to stress that when I say a world without gender, I mean gender in the sense of a social system that ascribes meaning to being female or male. And this is important because we use gender for many other things, like, for example, gender identity. So I'm not talking about gender identity, but I'm talking about gender as a social system. And a world without gender is a world in which there is no a priori meaning to the fact that one has female or male genitalia. We don't have different expectations of them. We don't dress them differently. We don't expect other things from them, etc. And people often ask me whether in a world without gender, there would still be group level differences between humans with male and female genitalia. And I say that I don't know. And we talked about this a little earlier. I really don't know whether in a world without this binary social system, there would be differences. There could be, and there could be no differences. And I would expect actually that in different cultures, there would be different differences. But what I can say is that in a world without gender, we wouldn't care. And this is the important thing. And we wouldn't care. And what I want to say is that also today we shouldn't care. So, for example, if I love martial arts, which I actually do, why should I care whether martial arts is more common in humans with male or female genitalia? I don't care whether it's more common, in people with blue and or brown eyes. And the reason that I don't care is not because I read many scientific studies showing that there are actually no differences between humans with blue and brown eyes in how much they like martial arts. The reason I don't care is that eye color is not considered an important social aspect or social category. And the same should be for sex differences. So we shouldn't care. If I love martial arts, I love martial arts. Why should I care whether this is more common in humans with male or female genitalia? So the fact that there is or there aren't gender differences in whatever shouldn't affect me. And for those people who think of gender and the gender social order as a direct consequence of sex, I say, if this is what you believe, you shouldn't care about getting rid of gender because it would reemerge anyway. So you're the first that you'd say, there is no problem. We don't need to raise boys to be boys and girls to be girls. They are males, they are females. They will just grow up this way. And this is really hard to, grasp. Then think, you have a dog. You don't teach your dog to become a dog. He's a dog. She's a dog. They will become dogs. So if you really believe that gender is a direct consequence of sex, you should be the first to just say, we can just get rid of this social system. It will reemerge. And the fact that we put so much effort into this social system, we put so much effort into pushing people, individuals, kids, into these boxes, 2 boxes. I don't want to say anything about whether this means that this is not natural. I just want to say we should just, stop with this system. It's harming everyone, not just trans people, not just non-binary people. It's harming everyone. No one fits the boys box or the girls box. No one fits the woman box or the man box. And this is just causing suffering. We should get rid of this, and we shouldn't care whether in a world without gender, there are some group level differences between humans with male or female genitalia, just as we shouldn't care whether there are differences between people with brown and blue eyes or with brown and white skin.
And your book points out that a lot of people actually already experience the world this way. You surveyed several thousand cisgendered people, And that means people whose gender identity aligns with the sex of their body or the sex that they were assigned at birth. And you surveyed several thousand and found that most people report not feeling 100% like their assigned gender anyway, that people experience the world and say, "Oh, I don't tick all of the man boxes, or I don't tick all of the woman boxes." That's not how the world is often experienced by anyone.
Most people have both feminine and masculine characteristics. What we did is go to core gender identity. Ask people, how much do you feel as a woman? How much do you feel as a man? And usually these questions are studied only in people that do not fit the normative, normative was, how do you call them?
With quotation marks around
Yeah,
it, yeah.
with quotation marks. And what we did is actually we asked cisgender individuals, and we were surprised that many, not most, but many cisgender individuals reported sometimes feeling also as the other gender or as no gender. And again, the binary framework assumes that if you were born male, you will grow up to feel as a boy, become a man, be sexually attracted to women. And similarly, if you were born female. But usually people do not study this, do not ask whether this is indeed the case. So they assume this to be the case for the normative, again, in quotation marks, population or individuals. And they study only individuals that deviate from this assumed normativity. And when you actually study the normative population, you find out that they are not as normative as you would expect. And they experience many what we could call queer or trans experiences.
What do you suggest that parents do, or aunts or uncles or people that interact with our kids? What are some things that we can do to reach toward this world where gender doesn't determine everything, or that we don't have these boxes to squeeze everybody into? What are some practical things people can do?
So one thing is to, when you treat others, could be your kids, could be other people, try in your head to switch the sex. So ask yourself, if this person was a man, would I be treating him or her the same way? If this kid was a girl, would I be treating this kid the same way? And if the answer is no, then you are gender biased and maybe you want to change how you treat this person. So this is in the very individual level. When you have kids, just give them and expose them to many activities, toys, etc. Of course, without labeling them as appropriate to boys or girls. But this is not enough, because even if you grow your kids in a gender neutral way, they are exposed to the world, and the world is not gender neutral. So they go out and they see that there are differences and people treat them differently, and they need to know about this. So I suggest to immune our kids against this instead of denying the existence of the gender system. So my kids, for example, growing up, they could say, hey, mom, see this toy store, so funny that they colored one half of the store in blue and the other half in pink, and we could discuss what this means and how it affects their ability to choose from the pink or the blue sections of the store, and why this is actually, a pity, because this restricts the ability of kids to just choose whatever they want. So I try to teach them that some people, not all people, I don't, but other people do believe that boys and girls are different, to do different things, but you yourself, know that this is not true. And this helps them keep to themselves or know who they are and what they like, even when they face other opinions or stereotypes from the outside. So one of my kids really loved soccer, and he was playing and was in team, etc. And he was also, he really loved playing the piano. So he was also learning how to play the piano. And he came one day, they were coming back from a game, and reported on a discussion that they had on the bus with other kids saying, talking about kids who love soccer, they don't love, they don't play the piano. And I don't know if he said something to them, but he came to me and he said, I was really feeling sorry for these kids. Because, obviously you can, love football or love soccer and love playing the piano, but they don't think so. And they miss this thing that I love so much, and they are not able to experience this. So I think this is important. And it's not important that he, told them or didn't tell them. Of course, you don't have to send your kids to do these wars But it's important that he could say, I love playing the piano and I have soccer, and there is nothing wrong with this.
Right. And they're aware that this is a dynamic that exists in the world and that it will be something they kind of have to go uphill with right now. And yeah, just I think being aware of that and letting your kids know that you're aware of it and talking about it with them, that's a really important point, that we can't just pretend that we live in this perfect world and treat our kids that way and not expect that external pressures won't have an effect. And so, yeah, being involved with them and talking through it with them it's really helpful advice.
Yeah, because I think, if we deny this, if we just said, boys and girls are the same, and then they go out of the world, and let's say, I have 3 boys, most of my example are with boys, and 2 of them really liked pink, and they would have pink things, but going out to the world, just thinking that everyone thinks that pink is okay for boys, and then maybe being ridiculed by other kids, etc. This could be a very aversive experience. And it could also mean that they would not trust me anymore. Because I said, there is no problem, but there is a problem.
Yeah, right.
It's a problem from the wrong reasons. And I remember, one time, one of my kids, they bought this kind of pink shirt for school. And then the next morning, he told me, Mom, I really love this color, but I just don't feel like going to school and explaining to all the other kids that it's okay for boys to love pink. And I told him, this is perfectly fine. It's only important that you know that you love pink. You don't have to, you choose your battles. And you don't have to do this now.
That's right. That's Daphna Joel. She's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Tel Aviv University and one of today's revolutionary specialists on sex, brain, and gender. And we're talking about the book, The Gender Mosaic, Beyond the Myth of the Male and Female Brain. All right, Daphna, let's close with a segment called Regrets, Challenges, and Surprises. So this is an opportunity for you to reflect on what it was like to make this book, and you can speak to 1, 2, or all 3 of these things. Something you would change about the book now that it's out, something that was the hardest challenge about putting this book together, or something that surprised you and changed your view. And in this case, I think you probably had done a lot of the research ahead of time, so I can't imagine that much of the surprise happened in creating the book, probably more as you were researching. But talk about maybe some regrets, challenges, or surprises.
So I would go with my idea of my dream of the book was to have a very short book that you can read like within an hour and would affect the way you think about sex, brain, and gender. Because I knew from my students, and by now I have hundreds of students, that the course in which I teach these things really affects their lives. And I wanted to have a very short and simple book. But no one would agree for a very short book that you can read within an hour, and they wanted to have it longer. Still, it's a very short book compared to what's out there, but it's longer than what I wanted. So my regret is that, and I don't know if I could do it otherwise, but now, for example, it's more popular to have very short books.
Yeah.
I think Amazon or whatever, some of the publishers do this. So my regret and my wish is maybe to have another edition which is much shorter, really having all these very, very crucial chapters that people can easily read and have a new way of thinking about these issues.
That's interesting because you're right. I mean, it is a very short book. I found it to be very well written. It's kind of a breezy read, especially for getting into such scientific ideas. But I think you're right. We're living in a time when like a TikTok video might be the place where somebody gets all their information about about the gender mosaic. So it's a fast-paced world and people want their info in bite-sized things. I mean, even doing this podcast, my interviews are about an hour long, and a lot of podcasters will say, if you're doing this kind of in-depth discussion, that's probably not necessarily a good length. It's one that I like, so that's why I produce it. And really I just want to be fair to the subject and so, yeah, it's longer, but yeah, people would say, we want 15 or 20 minutes and that's it. We're ready for the next thing. So I don't know. My hope is that people digest this stuff like in 15-minute chunks and just, throughout the week. But I definitely relate to that of like, if I could make this shorter, maybe I could reach more people. But I will say I loved the book. I thought the length of the book was great. It's also just such a cute little book. It's this little book fits in your hand and it's got nice size font. It doesn't feel like I'm squinting so I think very well produced, very well designed, and I certainly learned a ton from this little book, Daphna. So with that regret aside, maybe, I don't know, maybe someday you'll go out and write the mini book that you dream of now.
Yeah, maybe.
Also, before we go, I do want to mention people can check out the images that we talked about at your website, and there's more at your website. Let people know a little bit about what you've got online that people can learn from.
So we recently launched a website in which people can do a very short survey and then see their own gender mosaic. So see how feminine and masculine they are on 40 different traits. And obviously what's feminine and what's masculine differs between cultures. So after you finish and you see your own gender mosaic compared to a sample from the USA, you can choose another country, Japan, Israel, I don't know, Nigeria, and you can see how your mosaic changes, because obviously, I mean, you don't change. The same answer, you don't have to redo the questionnaire. It's just
Yeah.
how feminine or masculine you are compared to different cultures changes.
Yeah.
So you can experience not only your gender mosaic, but also how it changes in different cultures. And also there are many fun facts about differences between men and women across these different cultures.
Cool. What's the website?
gendermosaic.tauacal.
Okay, great. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well, so people can check that out. Well, thanks for joining us today, Daphna. Again, the book is Gender Mosaic, Beyond the Myth of the Male and Female Brain, and this was a great discussion. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Relationscapes, and if you enjoyed this one, I'll recommend a few fellow traveler episodes about gender roles. You can try out Matthew Gutman's episode, Testosterone, Y Chromosomes, and Other Manly Excuses. If you're looking for more practical advice about how to break through gender stereotypes in relationships, check out Kate Mangino's episode, Creating More Equal Partnerships. All right, and here's the part where I ask you for a favor. Please take a second to rate and review Relationscapes in Apple Podcasts. And the review doesn't have to be long. Check out LJ's review. I just got this one. It just says, "Love is love," and it's got a cute little heart emoji. Or my friend Chelsea G, who said, "I always learn so much listening to such a smart and heartfelt show." Thanks for that review, Chelsea G. You can use a few more words if you want. My friend Jess Britt 7 sent in a review that says, "These are the conversations we need to be having. Blair approaches things with warmth and knowledge that leads to fantastic interviews with a diverse group of guests." That's such a kind review, Jess. Thanks so much. And now, dear listener, I invite you to go and do thou likewise. Rate and review Relationscapes. I have a goal. I want to get 100 ratings in Apple Podcasts by the end of the year, by the end of 2025. We're in December right now. Let's see if we can get there. You can help me if you go. Come on, I'm right there. You can get me across that finish line and help me reach my goal. You can also rate the show in Spotify, and I'm also doing some TikTok stuff, so hop on TikTok and look up Relationscapes. I'm on there. Mates of State provides our theme song. I'm your host, Blair Hodges, a journalist in Salt Lake City, and I'll see you on another episode.
They came in, they told me one day, they said, "You will not believe what they are going to do to North Nashville."
I remember white men coming and pounding a red and white stake where I live, and measurements were taken.
All the houses, they were all torn down.
They were all gone. It changed everything.
A highway ripped through the heart of this historically black neighborhood. But the community's elders stood their ground.
There are some of us, we stayed in the hood.
Because this is home. The North Nashville before the interstate, before urban renewal, integration, gentrification, this North Nashville lives in these elders.
This is their story.
I'm Andrea Tudhope.
And I'm Simone Boyd.
And we're the hosts of the podcast, We Are North Nashville.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts.